Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's get right to it. We're going on with the Fast API docs. Oh yeah, it's fast. It's super fast. Fast and Furious. Too Fast, Too Furious. Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift. Oh yeah. Anyways. I had fun. We have fun here. I feel like that's from South Park. Have fun. We have fun. That's from I forget the episode, but it was something about like there was like a big scandal, I want to say, with something like some sports team had some sort of sexual abuse scandal, and I think that was from that episode. We have fun. We have fun here. Um, anyways, so we went through to request bodies yesterday and how it's like created by Pydantic models. So today we're just going a little deeper into the different parameter types and the capacities of validation and things like that, and how we would do that appropriately in FastAPI and Python. So as we already discussed, you can do the type annotation of stir or none equals none. So that essentially says that this parameter, which is by the way parsed as a query parameter, not a path parameter nor a body, because for it to be a path parameter, it would be included into the path. So it'll be item slash in like little curly braces item ID, for example. And since that is not the case, it's going to be a query parameter, which after your path parameters are completed, there's like a little question mark. And then you have your query parameters, which are key value pairs, and they're conjoined with the ampersand. We also went over why the distinction between query parameters and bodies. Um, Essentially, it's a mix of things. It improves logging, reduces overhead if you only have a few key value pairs, overhead of serialization or deserialization of the JSON object. And there's also a standards thing, for example, like with and standards and conventions. For example, with the get, most intermediaries and others, even though FastAPI itself doesn't impose this, uh, doesn't really allow for a body in get in the requests. I mean, so um, if you this is how you would define a query parameter that's optional, stir or none equals none. Honestly, it just becomes, if you just give it any sort of default value, it'll automatically become an optional parameter, because that parameter will automatically be populated by whatever value you give. So it doesn't need to be none, it doesn't need to be this way. This is essentially saying the type can be stir or none, and equals none is saying that the default value is none, right? If I removed the equals none, then this value actually becomes required, except that that required value can be a none type, and that's fine. So that's okay. Going into the next bit is using annotated and query, which is a function that returns an instance of a class, I believe, right? So annotated, we talked about early on in this, wherein annotated can be used to give more metadata in type annotations. So here, annotated stir or none. So we have defined as previous that string or none could be the option, and then we pass it this, and we pass it query, and give that function max length 50. So what that would essentially do is, whenever this query parameter is received, it will be type validated to be either a string or a none. It has to be one of those two, and make sure that the max length does not exceed 50 characters, I'm presuming, right? And then the default value is the same as before, none. That's all this is doing. And doing it with annotated helps, like and this is in 3.10 plus. There's older versions and variants without annotations, without using annotate it from the typing module, but this is the recommended way. So we're just going to focus on this. Um, this basically gets documented in the Open API schema. So when someone's looking at the Swagger or the Redoc, whatever they choose, they'll get like this info presented to them, and on top of that, that data will be validated on input requests, or otherwise a error will be returned with like a neat description that describes the issue, right? So it makes it very easy for you to take care of those kinds of issues by just like doing proper type validations. And this is just going into that a little bit further. Add query to annotate. Okay, it's just literally breaking down that code. The old version, so I'm just going to go over this super briefly. Basically, before annotated was a part of the typing module, the way to have done this was to actually set the default to the query function and give that the parameter default equals none. But this causes other issues wherein, like, if a function isn't what's the word I'm looking for, if a function isn't is used elsewhere in Python, not like just through a request response, it can cause typing issues and things like that. So yeah, so it's not the preferred way to do it, but it is a way to do it. And if query is being used as the default value, if query is being used in annotated, you can't use the default keyword parameter because it obviously it causes confusion. So I don't know if this would actually literally throw an error, but maybe it would. I don't know. Therefore, the default value of the function parameter is the actual default value. That's more intuitive with Python in general. That's why using annotated is more advantageous, or one of the reasons. You can call in other places without fast API and it will work as expected. And instead use the old. If you call that function without fast API in other places, you have to remember to pass the arguments to the function for it to work correctly. Otherwise, the values will be different from what you expect. Example, query info or something similar instead of string. Yeah. So, like I said, you'll get like a default of query info type, which may not react Pythonically if you want. If you do like if X, right, and you're hoping for a Pythonic truthiness or falseness where it's none or something like that, it'll cause issues with that. So no, don't do that. Preferably just use the annotated. Oh crap. All right, sorry about that, guys. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but my mom has cancer. She's currently undergoing chemotherapy, well, technically immunotherapy. And I could hear her dry heaving, so I just kind of rushed. So I had to pause that. I don't know, you guys might not notice because it was just like click click, but because I paused and then I continued the recording. But yeah, make sure the recording is still going. Yes, it is. Okay. Anyways, so where was I? So that's the advantages of using annotated. Query and all the other ways to validate other parameter types, which we'll get into shortly, all have like other things we can do, other validation things like minimum length, maximum length. We can add regular expressions with pattern. We can what's the word I'm looking for? What is this? Default. You can of course use default values other than none. This seems like an obvious thing, but I guess they pointed out because they really want to hit the lowest common denominator for people who use the docs, which is fair. So, and here it's just like stating the difference between required and not required parameters, essentially being the existence of a default value, essentially. So if you want to declare it as required, blah, 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 required can be none. You can have the string or none without a default value. So make it required, but that can be none, which is fine, apparently. query parameter list slash multiple values. When you define a query parameter explicitly with query, you can also declare to receive a list of values or what is this? Oh, this is basically about, you know, having a query parameter that you can get multiple times, like using the same parameter multiple times. So q equals foo, q equals foo, q equals bar, blah blah blah. It'll all get put into this list of strings, and that's what you read. So that's neat. What else? Query parameter list slash multiple values with defaults. This is basically a very obvious statement that yes, even when it's a list of strings, you can get you can still set default values for a query path parameter. And you can also use list directly instead of list of strings. That just basically kills the capacity for type validation within the list. And you can, there's other metadata. You can declare the title, give it a description. There's other things you can do with query, and you can also set up aliases. So for example, if this query parameter shows up, you want it to show up as item-query, which is not something that can be a valid Python name. So even though in Python you would access it with Q, when someone sends you a request object, essentially it will show up as item-query. And at least that's my understanding of this. Yeah, see, it shows up here in item-query when you set up that alias. And you can also set another thing of deprecation, whether or not a particular parameter is deprecated. So in package development ecosystems, you must have noticed like, oh, this thing is deprecated, but then you use it and it's like, oh, this is working fine. Why is this deprecated, right? Because essentially either it's being swapped out for equivalent functionality or something like that. And for that to happen, something else is being built from the ground. Whatever reason, a particular endpoint or feature or whatever is going to stop being used, right? And deprecated equals true sets up that metadata so that when someone checks the docs or whatever, it's like, oh, that thing's deprecated. You know, we're not gonna, if I'm starting a new project, I'm not gonna use it. And if I'm not starting a new project and I have an old project that's using a deprecated endpoint, I as a developer know like, okay, I should check my code and remove the usage of this endpoint or whatever. And an easy way in Fast API to do it is just to like set it up in the metadata using this query function. You can set it up to include in schema equals false, meaning that's another thing where essentially it won't show up in the OpenAPI schema. You can do custom validations, which is interesting. So essentially you have to import it from Pydantic directly. And if you have a function that does some sort of validation, wherein in this case is setting the prefix of ISBN hyphen or IMDb hyphen, you can, in the annotated metadata, set up after validator check valid ID equals none, and that will do those additional validations, right? Wonder if you can do annotated and what's the word I'm looking for? After validator together. I am going to add a task for that. I'm just going to pause recording while I do that. So maybe in the next video or something, I'll test out whether annotated and after validator work in conjunction with query parameters, the query metadata or path metadata, as you'll see shortly. So here's essentially the recap of all the things you can use. Moving on to path parameters. So this page is actually very similar to the previous page and requires even less descriptions because just how there's query, there's also path, and it's all about providing the metadata and maybe helping out with validations for path parameters. Um, and also in this particular page, also describing numeric validations, which you can set up on path parameters, and I believe in query parameters as well. There's also a thing about ordering here, when if you have, like, for example, it's just in your head, it's natural for you to be like, okay, in a function definition, I'm going to do the path parameters first, then I'll do the query parameters, then the bodies, right? It seems natural to place it that way, but if you do it the non-annotated way and you set a default value or whatever, or even if you don't do it that way, even if you do it with annotated and there's a default value or whatever, it might complain if that. So for example, item ID is this. If you put it in the beginning, it could complain like so. Anything else for them? So you don't really need to use query, but you still need to use path for the item ID. And when you use annotated, for some reason Python will complain if you put a value with a default before a value that doesn't have a default. And the reason for this of Python, like throwing a syntax error or whatever, is because essentially things with a default value are generically seen as keyword arguments by Python for some reason. I'm not really sure why that's the case, but it is. And basically the notation to get over that is you can do star, comma, and then whatever, and then everything past that point is seen as a keyword argument, which fixes this issue. But if you just use annotated on its own, I think that resolves the issue instead of setting up annotated as default values or whatever. It's just a thing to keep in mind between arguments and keyword arguments, and if you run into a weird bug with that, you can fix that. Alright, continuing on. So path, okay. Anyways, let's just get into numeric validations. So we can do numeric validations similar to how we did string validations for query parameters. There's GE, there's GT, there's LELT, which is greater than or equal to, greater than, less than or equal to. And you can just give it numbers for numeric things. Now, once again, APIs are all JSON, and JSON is all strings. But doing all of this allows FastAPI to essentially convert everything to the appropriate types for you to do your regular Pythonic function, basically. So that's really nice. Number validations, floats greater than and less than. So it's just saying that you can do this with floats as well, and you can do this with query as well. All the examples are with path, but it's also with queries. I think they just wanted to mix and match and show you path as well. And since that itself would be a very slight page, they added the numeric validation stuff on the same page as well. That's the recap. Here's everything we can do when it comes to numeric validations. Pretty straightforward, all good stuff. So this was the thing I was trying to say earlier about it being a function, even though it's capitalized, and you're like, oh, that's a class instance, right? So apparently when you import query, path, and others from FastAPI, they're actually functions, and when called, they return instances of classes of the same name. Very weird. So you import query, which is actually a function, and when you call it, it returns an instance of a class also named query. These functions are there instead of just using the classes directly, so that your editor doesn't mark errors about their types. That way you can use normal editor and coding tools without having to add custom configurations to disregard those errors. So basically, most editors will complain like, you can't give a class as in this particular context, right? Because in annotated, I'm guessing that's how it works. But yeah, so that's what that is. Gonna move on to query parameter models. What's up? if you have a group of query parameters that are related, you can create a Pydantic model to declare them. So earlier when we spoke about response bodies and request bodies, we were talking about Pydantic models, and that's how request and response bodies are defined in FastAPI. We can actually do that with a grouping of query parameters as well, and just say annotated filter params comma query, since even if we don't give it any sort of metadata validation thing other than just saying query, it's now FastAPI knows that filtered query has these params in filtered params, which is a Pydantic extension of the base model, and these are query parameters because it's been given this query function, or query function basically. FastAPI will extract the data for each field from the query parameters in the request and give you the Pydantic model you define. So yeah, pretty straightforward there. Good stuff. Oh my god, it's midnight. I haven't realized how late it is. It's all good. So if you go to the docs, you can see these query parameters listed here that we've collected into this one Pydantic model. You can also set up model configs for extra 4-bit. I don't know. I'm pretty sure there's probably other things you can do with model config, but as of right now, at this point in the docs, this is the only thing I know. And essentially, it means that other than these 4 limit, offset, order byte, and tags, you can't give any other query params, which you don't necessarily have to do in many situations. If you don't do that, and if someone gives you a query parameter that's not used, it just gets ignored. So yeah, and that's why. If a client tries to send some extra data in the query parameters, they will receive an error response. Boom. So totally chill, totally straightforward. I'm gonna call it here, even though I went through to body nested models. It's also pretty straightforward stuff. It's nothing that's like, oh my god, this is changing my world. It's just some small stuff that I think I already know about APIs. I'm just going to keep reading it because I think cookie parameters were things I'm like, and same with header parameters. I don't know what all of these things really are, so I think I'll probably try and get to maybe extra models or something like that tomorrow, and make a more deeper video then that goes into all of this. So that's it for today. Believe in yourselves, whoever's watching. It's important. It's essential even. All right, have a great one. Bye-bye.